Rowland blushed. He desired to justify himself in the most veracious manner. "The truth is," he said, "that I am afraid I care only in the second place for Roderick's," holding up his head. "What I care for in the first place is your happiness." "I don't know why that should be," she answered. "I have certainly done nothing to make you so much my friend. If you were to tell me you intended to leave us tomorrow, I am afraid that I should not venture to ask you to stay. But whether you go or stay, let us not talk of Roderick." "But that," said Rowland, "does NT answer my question? Is he better?" "No," she said, and turned away. He was careful not to tell her that he intended to leave them one day shortly after this, as the two young men sat at the indoor, watching the sunset, which on that evening was very striking, and lurid Rowland made an attempt to sound his companion's present sentiment. "Touching Christina Light, I wonder where she is," he said, "and what sort of a life she is leading her prince." Roderick at first made no response. He was watching a figure on the summit of some distant rocks opposite to them. The figure was apparently descending into the valley, and in relief against the crimson screen of the western sky, it looked gigantic. "Christina Light," Roderick at last repeated, as if arousing himself from a reverie. "Where she is, it's extraordinary how little I care." "Have you then completely got over it?" To this Roderick made no direct reply. He sat brooding a while. "She's a humbug," he presently exclaimed. "Possibly," said Rowland, "but I have known worse ones." "She disappointed me," Roderick continued in the same tone. "Had she then really given you hopes?" "Oh, don't recall it," Roderick cried. "Why the devil should I think of it? It was only 3 months ago, but it seems like 10 years. His friend said nothing more, and after a while, he went on of his own accord. "I believed there was a future in it all. She pleased me, and when an artist such as I was is pleased, you know," and he paused. "Again, you never saw her, as I did. You never heard her in her great moments. But there is no use talking about that. At first, she would regard me seriously. She chaffed me and made light of me. But at last, I forced her to admit I was a great man. Think of that, sir. Christina Light called me a great man. A great man was what she was looking for. And we agreed to find our happiness for life in each other. To please me, she promised not to marry till I gave her leave. I was not in a marrying way myself. But it was damnation to think of another man possessing her. To spare my sensibilities, she promised to turn off her prince, and the idea of her doing so made me as happy as to see a perfect statue shaping itself in the block. You have seen how she kept her promise. When I learned it, it was as if the statue had suddenly cracked and turned hideous. She died for me like that," and he snapped his fingers. "Was it wounded vanity, disappointed desire, betrayed confidence? I am sure, I don't know, you certainly have some name for it." "The poor girl did the best she could," said Rowland. "If that was her best, so much the worse for her. I have hardly thought of her these 2 months, but I have not forgiven her." "Well, you may believe that you are avenged. I can't think of her as happy." "I don't pity her," said Roderick. Then he relapsed into silence, and the two sat watching the colossal figure as it made its way downward along the jagged silhouette of the rocks. "Who is this mighty man?" cried Roderick at last. "And what is he coming down upon us? For we are small people here, and we can't undertake to keep company with giants." "Wait till we meet him on our own level," said Rowland, "and perhaps he will not overtop us." "For 10 minutes, at least," Roderick rejoined. "He will have been a great man at this moment." The figure sank beneath the horizon line and became invisible in the uncertain light. Suddenly Roderick said, "I would like to see her once more, simply to look at her." "I would not advise it," said Rowland. "It was her beauty that did it," Roderick went on. "It was all her beauty in comparison. The rest was nothing. What befooled me was to think of it as my property, and I had made it mine. No one else had studied it, as I had no one else understood it. What does that stick of a Casamassima know about it at this hour? I should like to see it just once more. It's the only thing in the world of which I can say so." "I would not advise it," Rowland repeated. "That's right, dear Rowland," said Roderick. "Don't advise. That's no use now." The dusk meanwhile had thickened, and they had not perceived a figure approaching them across the open space in front of the house. Suddenly, it stepped into the circle of light projected from the door and windows, and they beheld little Sam Singleton stopping to stare at them. He was the giant whom they had seen. Descending along the rocks, when this was made apparent, Roderick was seized with a fit of intense hilarity. It was the first time he had laughed in 3 months. Singleton, who carried a knapsack and walking staff, received from Rowland the friendliest welcome. He was in the serenest possible humor, and if in the way of luggage his knapsack contained nothing but a comb and a second shirt, he produced from it a dozen admirable sketches. He had been trudging over half Switzerland and making everywhere the most vivid pictorial notes. They were mostly in a box at Interlaken, and in gratitude for Rowland's appreciation, he presently telegraphed for his box, which, according to the excellent Swiss method, was punctually delivered by post. The nights were cold, and our friends, with 3 or 4 other chance sojourners, sat indoors over a fire of logs. Even with Roderick sitting moodily in the outer shadow, they made a sympathetic little circle, and they turned over Singleton's drawings. While he perched in the chimney corner, blushing and grinning with his feet on the rounds of his chair, he had been pedestrianizing for 6 weeks, and he was glad to rest a while at Engelthal. It was an economic repose, however, for he sallied forth every morning with his sketching tools on his back, in search of material for new studies. Roderick's hilarity after the first evening had subsided, and he watched the little painter's serene activity with a gravity that was almost portentous. Singleton, who was not in the secret of his personal misfortunes, still treated him with timid frankness as the rising star of American art. Roderick had said to Rowland at first that Singleton reminded him of some curious little insect with a remarkable mechanical instinct in its antennae, but as the days went by it was apparent that the modest landscapist's unflagging industry grew to have an oppressive meaning for him. It pointed a moral, and Roderick used to sit and con the moral as he saw it figured in Singleton's bent back on the hot hillsides protruding from beneath his white umbrella. One day he wandered up a long slope and overtook him as he sat at work. Singleton related the incident afterwards to Rowland, who, after giving him in Rome a hint of Roderick's aberrations, had strictly kept his own counsel. "Are you always like this?" said Roderick, in almost sepulchral accents. "Like this," repeated Singleton, blinking confusedly, with an alarmed conscience. "You remind me of a watch that never runs down. If one listens hard, one hears you always tick-tick-tick-tick." "Oh, I see," said Singleton, beaming ingenuously. "I am very equable." "You are very equable, yes. And do you find it pleasant to be equable?" Singleton turned and grinned more brightly while he sucked the water from his camel-share brush. Then, with a quickened sense of his indebtedness to a providence that had endowed him with intrinsic facilities, "Oh, delightful!" he exclaimed. Roderick stood looking at him a moment. "Damnation," he said at last solemnly, and turned his back. One morning shortly after this, Rowland and Roderick took a long walk. They had walked before in a dozen different directions, but they had not yet crossed a charming little wooded pass which shut in their valley on one side and descended into the vale of Engelberg. Incoming from Lucerne, they had approached their inn by this path, and feeling that they knew it, had hitherto neglected it in favor of untrodden ways. But at last the list of these was exhausted, and Rowland proposed the walk to Engelberg as a novelty. The place is half bleak and half pastoral. A huge white monastery rises abruptly from the green floor of the valley and complicates its picturesqueness with an element rare in Swiss scenery. Hard by is a group of chalets and inns with the usual appurtenances of a prosperous Swiss resort. Lion brown guides in baggy homespun lounging under carved wooden galleries, stacks of alpenstocks in every doorway. Sun-scorched Englishmen without shirt collars. Our two friends sat a while at the door of an inn discussing a pint of wine, and then Roderick, who was indefatigable, announced his intention of climbing to a certain rocky pinnacle which overhung the valley, and according to the testimony of one of the guides, commanded a view of the lake of Lucerne. To go and come back was only a matter of an hour, but Rowland, with the prospect of his homeward trudge before him, confessed to a preference for lounging on his bench, or at most strolling a trifle farther, and taking a look at the monastery. Roderick went off alone, and his companion after a while bent his steps to the monasterial church. It was remarkable, like most of the churches of Catholic Switzerland, for a hideous style of devotional ornament, but it had a certain cold and musty picturesqueness, and Rowland lingered there with some tenderness for alpine piety. While he was near the high altar, some people came in at the west door, but he did not notice them and was presently engaged in deciphering a curious old German epitaph on one of the mural tablets. At last, he turned away wondering whether its syntax or its theology was the more uncomfortable, and to this infinite surprise found himself confronted with the Prince and Princess Casamassima. The surprise on Christina's part for an instant was equal, and at first she seemed disposed to turn away without letting it give place to a greeting. The prince, however, saluted gravely, and then Christina in silence put out her hand. Rowland immediately asked whether they were staying at Engelberg, but Christina only looked at him without speaking. The prince answered his questions and related that they had been making a month's tour in Switzerland, that at Lucerne his wife had been somewhat obstinately indisposed, and that the physician had recommended a week's trial of the tonic air and goat's milk of Engelberg. The scenery, said the prince, was stupendous, but the life was terribly saddened. They had 3 days more. It was a blessing, he urbanely added, to see a good Roman face. Christina's attitude, her solemn silence, and her penetrating gaze seemed to Rowland at first to savor of affectation, but he presently perceived that she was profoundly agitated, and that she was afraid of betraying herself. "Do let us leave this hideous edifice," she said. "There are things here that set one's teeth on edge." They moved slowly to the door, and when they stood outside in the sunny coolness of the valley, she turned to Rowland and said, "I am extremely glad to see you." Then she glanced about her and observed against the wall of the church an old stone seat. She looked at Prince Casamassima a moment, and he smiled more intensely, Rowland thought, than the occasion demanded. "I wish to sit here," she said, "and speak to Mr. Mallet alone." "At your pleasure, dear friend," said the prince. The tone of each was measured to Rowland's ear, but that of Christina was dry, and that of her husband was splendidly urbane. Rowland remembered that the Cavalier Giacosa had told him that Mrs. Light's candidate was thoroughly a prince, and our friend wondered how he relished a peremptory accent. Casamassima was an Italian of the undemonstrative type, but Rowland nevertheless divined that, like other princes before him, he had made the acquaintance of the thing called compromise. "Shall I come back?" he asked, with the same smile. "In half an hour," said Christina. In the clear outer light, Rowland's first impression of her was that she was more beautiful than ever, and yet, in 3 months, she could hardly have changed. The change was in Rowland's own vision of her, which that last interview on the eve of her marriage had made unprecedentedly tender. "How came you here?" she asked. "Are you staying in this place?" "I am staying at Engelthal, some 10 miles away. I walked over." "Are you alone?" "I am with Mr. Hudson." "Is he here with you?" "He went half an hour ago to climb a rock for a view." "And his mother and that young girl, where are they?" "They also are at Engelthal." "What do you do there?" "What do you do here?" said Rowland, smiling. "I count the minutes till my week is up. I hate mountains. They depress me to death. I am sure Miss Garland likes them." "She is very fond of them, I believe." "You believe it, don't you know, but I have given up trying to imitate Miss Garland," said Christina. "You surely need imitate no one." "Don't say that," she said gravely. "So you have walked 10 miles this morning, and you are to walk back again." "Back again to supper." "And Mr. Hudson, too." "Mr. Hudson, especially, he is a great walker." "You men are happy," Christina cried. "I believe I should enjoy the mountains if I could do such things. It is sitting still, and having them scowl down at you. Prince Casamassima never rides. He only goes on a mule. He was carried up the Faulhorn on a litter." "On a litter," said Rowland. "In one of those machines, chaise portuous, like a woman." Rowland received this information in silence. It was equally unbecoming to either relish or deprecate its irony. "Is Mr. Hudson to join you again? Will he come here?" Christina asked. "I shall soon begin to expect him." "What shall you do when you leave Switzerland?" Christina continued. "Shall you go back to Rome?" "I rather doubt it. My plans are very uncertain." "They depend upon Mr. Hudson, eh?" "In a great measure." I want you to tell me about him. Is he still in that perverse state of mind that afflicted you so much?" Rowland looked at her mistrustfully. Without answering, he was indisposed instinctively to tell her that Roderick was unhappy. It was possible she might offer to help him back to happiness. She immediately perceived his hesitation. "I see no reason why we should not be frank," she said. "I should think we were excellently placed for that sort of thing. You remember that formerly I cared very little what I said, don't you? Well, I care absolutely not at all now. I say what I please, I do what I please." "How did Mr. Hudson receive the news of my marriage?" "Very badly," said Rowland, with rage and reproaches, and as Rowland hesitated, again with silent contempt. "I can tell you but little. He spoke to me on the subject, but I stopped him. I told him it was none of his business or of mine." "That was an excellent answer," said Christina softly, "yet it was a little your business. After those sublime protestations, I treated you to I was really very fine that morning, eh?" "You do yourself injustice," said Rowland. "I should be at liberty now to believe you were insincere." "What does it matter now whether I was insincere or not? I can't conceive of anything mattering less. I was very fine, isn't it true?" "You know what I think of you," said Rowland, and for fear of being forced to betray his suspicion of the cause of her change, he took refuge in a commonplace. "Your mother, I hope, is well." "My mother is in the enjoyment of superb health, and may be seen every evening at the casino at the Baths of Lucca, confiding to every newcomer that she has married her daughter to a pearl of a prince." Rowland was anxious for news of Mrs. Light's companion, and the natural course was frankly to inquire about him. "And the Cavaliere Giacosa is well?" he asked. Christina hesitated, but she betrayed no other embarrassment. "The Cavaliere has retired to his native city of Ancona upon a pension for the rest of his natural life. He is a very good old man." "I have a great regard for him," said Rowland gravely, at the same time that he privately wondered whether the Cavalier's pension was paid by Prince Casamassima for services rendered in connection with his marriage. Had the Cavalier received his commission? "And what do you do?" Rowland continued on leaving this place. "We go to Italy or go to Naples." She rose and stood silent a moment, looking down the valley. The figure of Prince Casamassima appeared in the distance, balancing his white umbrella. As her eyes rested upon it, Rowland imagined that he saw something deeper in the strange expression which had lurked in her face. While he talked to her, at first he had been dazzled by her blooming beauty, to which the lapse of weeks had only added splendor. Then he had seen a heavier ray in the light of her eye, a sinister intimation of sadness and bitterness. It was the outward mark of her sacrificed ideal. Her eyes grew cold as she looked at her husband, and when after a moment she turned them upon Rowland, they struck him as intensely tragical. He felt a singular mixture of sympathy and dread. He wished to give her a proof of friendship, and yet it seemed to him that she had now turned her face in a direction where friendship was impotent to interpose. She half read his feelings apparently, and she gave a beautiful sad smile. "I hope we may never meet again," she said, and as Rowland gave her a protesting look, "You have seen me at my best. I wish to tell you solemnly I was sincere. I know appearances are against me." She went on quickly, "There is a great deal I can't tell you. Perhaps you have guessed it. I care very little, you know. At any rate, I did my best. It would serve. I was beaten and broken. They were stronger than Roman one now. It's another affair." "It seems to me you have a large chance for happiness," yet said Rowland vaguely. "Happiness? I mean to cultivate rapture. I mean to go in for bliss ineffable. You remember I told you that I was in part the world's, and the devil's. Now they have taken me all. It was their choice. May they never repent." "I shall hear of you," said Rowland. "You will hear of me, and whatever you do here, remember this: I was sincere." Prince Casamassima had approached, and Rowland looked at him with a good deal of simple compassion, as a part of that world against which Christina had launched her mysterious menace. It was obvious that he was a good fellow, and that he could not in the nature of things be a positively bad husband, but his distinguished inoffensiveness only deepened the infelicity of Christina's situation, by depriving her defiant attitude of the sanction of relative justice. So long she had been free to choose, she had esteemed him, but from the moment she was forced to marry him, She had detested him. Rowland read, in the young man's elastic Italian mask, a profound consciousness of all this. And as he found there also a record of other curious things, of pride of temper, of bigotry, of an immense heritage, of more or less aggressive traditions, reflected that the matrimonial conjunction of his two companions might be sufficiently prolific in incident. "You are going to Naples," Rowland said to the prince by way of conversation. "We are going to Paris," Christina interposed slowly and softly. "We are going to London. We are going to Vienna. We are going to St. Petersburg." Prince Casamassima dropped his eyes and fretted the earth with the point of his umbrella, while he engaged Rowland's attention. Christina turned away. When Rowland glanced at her again, he saw a change pass over her face. She was observing something that was concealed from his own eyes by the angle of the church wall. In a moment, Roderick stepped into sight. He stopped short, astonished. His face and figure were jaded, his garments dusty. He looked at Christina from head to foot, and then slowly his cheek flushed, and his eye expanded. Christina returned his gaze, and for some moments there was a singular silence. "You don't look well," Christina said at last. Roderick answered nothing. He only looked and looked, as if she had been a statue. "You are no less beautiful," he presently cried. She turned away with a smile and stood a while gazing down the valley. Roderick stared at Prince Casamassima. Christina then put out her hand to Rowland. "Farewell," she said. "If you are near me in future, don't try to see me." And then, after a pause, in a lower tone, "I was sincere." She addressed herself again to Roderick and asked him some commonplace about his walk, but he said nothing. He only looked at her. Rowland at first had expected an outbreak of reproach, but it was evident that the danger was every moment diminishing. He was forgetting everything but her beauty, and as she stood there and let him feast upon it, Rowland was sure that she knew it. "I won't say farewell to you," she said. "We shall meet again." And she moved gravely away. Prince Casamassima took leave courteously of Rowland. Upon Roderick he bestowed a bow of exaggerated civility. Roderick appeared not to see it. He was still watching Christina. As she passed over the grass, his eyes followed her until she reached the door of her inn. Here she stopped and looked back at him. Chapter Roman 13, Switzerland. On the homeward walk that evening, Roderick preserved a silence which Rowland allowed to make him uneasy. Early on the morrow, Roderick, saying nothing of his intentions, started off on a walk. Rowland saw him striding with light steps along the rugged path to Engelberg. He was absent all day, and he gave no account of himself on his return. He said he was deadly tired, and he went to bed early. When he had left the room, Miss Garland drew near to Rowland. "I wish to ask you a question," she said. "What happened to Roderick yesterday at Engelberg?" "You have discovered that something happened," Rowland answered. "I am sure of it. Was it something painful?" "I don't know how at the present moment he judges it. He met the Princess Casamassima." "Thank you," said Miss Garland simply, and turned away. The conversation had been brief, but like many small things, it furnished Rowland with food for reflection. When one is looking for symptoms, one easily finds them. This was the first time Mary Garland had asked Rowland a question which it was in Roderick's power to answer. The first time she had frankly betrayed Roderick's reticence. Rowland ventured to think it marked an error. The next morning was sultry, and the air, usually so fresh at those altitudes, was oppressively heavy. Rowland lounged on the grass a while near Singleton, who was at work under his white umbrella within view of the house, and then, in quest of coolness, he wandered away to the rocky ridge, whence you looked across at the Jungfrau. Today, however, the white summits were invisible. Their heads were muffled in sullen clouds, and the valleys beneath them curtained in dun-colored mist. Rowland had a book in his pocket, and he took it out and opened it, but his page remained unturned. His own thoughts were more importunate. His interview with Christina Light had made a great impression upon him, and he was haunted with the memory of her almost blameless bitterness, and of all that was tragic and fatal in her latest transformation. These things were immensely appealing, and Rowland thought with infinite impatience of Roderick's having again encountered them. It required little imagination to apprehend that the young sculptor's condition had also appealed to Christina. His consummate indifference, his supreme defiance, would make him a magnificent trophy, and Christina had announced with sufficient distinctness that she had said goodbye to scruples. It was her fancy at present to treat the world as a garden of pleasure, and if hitherto she had played with Roderick's passion on its stem, there was little doubt that now she would pluck it with an unfaltering hand and drain it of its acrid sweetness. And why the deuce need Roderick have gone marching back to destruction? Rowland's meditations, even when they began in rancor, often brought him peace, but on this occasion they ushered in a quite peculiar quality of unrest. He felt conscious of a sudden collapse in his moral energy. A current that had been flowing for 2 years with liquid strength seemed at last to pause and evaporate. Rowland looked away at the stagnant vapors on the mountains. Their dreariness seemed a symbol of the dreariness which his own generosity had bequeathed him. At last, he had arrived at the uttermost limit of the deference a sane man might pay to other people's folly. Nay, rather, he had transgressed it. He had been befooled on a gigantic scale. He turned to his book and tried to woo back patience, but it gave him cold comfort, and he tossed it angrily away. He pulled his hat over his eyes and tried to wonder dispassionately whether atmospheric conditions had not something to do with his ill humor. He remained for some time in this attitude, but was finally aroused from it by a singular sense that although he had heard nothing, someone had approached him. He looked up and saw Roderick standing before him on the turf. His mood made the spectacle unwelcome, and for a moment he felt like uttering an uncivil speech. Roderick stood looking at him with an expression of countenance which had of late become rare. There was an unfamiliar spark in his eye, and a certain imperious alertness in his carriage. Confirmed habit with Rowland came speedily to the front. What is it now? He asked himself, and invited Roderick to sit down. Roderick had evidently something particular to say, and if he remained silent for a time, it was not because he was ashamed of it. "I would like you to do me a favor," he said at last. "Lend me some money." "How much do you wish?" Rowland asked. "Say 1,000 francs. Rowland hesitated a moment. "I don't wish to be indiscreet, but may I ask what you propose to do with 1,000 francs? "To go to Interlaken." "And why are you going to Interlaken?" Roderick replied without a shadow of wavering. "Because that woman is to be there." Rowland burst out laughing, but Roderick remained serenely grave. "You have forgiven her, then?" said Rowland. "Not a bit of it. I don't understand." "Neither do Roman. I only know that she is incomparably beautiful, and that she has waked me up amazingly. Besides, she asked me to come." "She asked you?" "Yesterday, in so many words." "Ah, the jade." "Exactly. I am willing to take her for that." "Why in the name of common sense did you go back to her? Why did I find her standing there like a goddess who had just stepped out of her cloud? Why did I look at her before I knew where I was? The harm was done." Rowland, who had been sitting erect, threw himself back on the grass and lay for some time staring up at the sky. At last, raising himself, "Are you perfectly serious?" he asked. "Deadly serious." "Your idea is to remain at Interlaken some time?" "Indefinitely," said Roderick, and it seemed to his companion that the tone in which he said this made it immensely well worth hearing. "And your mother and cousin, meanwhile, are to remain here? It will soon be getting very cold, you know." "It does seem much like it today." "Very true, but today is a day by itself. There is nothing to prevent their going back to Lucerne. I depend upon your taking charge of them." At this Rowland reclined upon the grass again, and again, after reflection, he faced his friend. "How would you express," he asked, "the character of the profit that you expect to derive from your excursion?" "I see no need of expressing it. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. The case is simply this: I desire immensely to be near Christina Light, and it is such a huge refreshment to find myself again desiring something that I propose to drift with the current. As I say, she has waked me up, and it is possible something may come of it. She makes me feel as if I were alive again. This," and he glanced down at the inn I call Death, "that I am very grateful to hear. You really feel as if you might do something." "Don't ask too much. I only know that she makes my heart beat, makes me see visions." "You feel encouraged." "I feel excited." "You are really looking better." "I am glad to hear it now that I have answered your questions. Please to give me the money." Rowland shook his head. "For that purpose I can't." "You can't?" "It's impossible. Your plan is rank folly. I can't help you in it." Roderick flushed a little, and his eye expanded. I will borrow what money I can then from Mary. This was not viciously said. It had simply the ring of passionate resolution. Instantly it brought Rowland to terms. He took a bunch of keys from his pocket and tossed it upon the grass. The little brass one opens my dressing case. He said you will find money in it. Roderick let the keys lie. Something seemed to have struck him. He looked askance at his friend. You are awfully gallant. You certainly are not. Your proposal is an outrage. Very likely it is a proof, the more of my desire. If you have so much steam on, then use it for something else. You say you are awake again. I am delighted. Only be so in the best sense. Isn't it very plain? If you have the energy to desire, you have also the energy to reason and to judge. If you can care to go, you can also care to stay, and staying being the more profitable course. The inspiration on that side for a man who has his self-confidence to win back again should be greater. Roderick plainly did not relish this simple logic, and his eye grew angry as he listened to its echo. Oh, the devil, he cried. Rowland went on. Do you believe that hanging about Christina Light will do you any good? Do you believe it won't? In either case, you should keep away from her. If it won't, it's your duty, and if it will, you can get on without it. Do me good, cried Roderick. What do I want of good? What should I do with good? I want what she gives me. Call it by what name you will. I want to ask no questions, but to take what comes and let it fill the impossible hours. But I didn't come to discuss the matter. I have not the least desire to discuss it, said Rowland. I simply protest. Roderick meditated a moment. I have never yet thought twice of accepting a favor of you, he said at last, but this one sticks in my throat. It is not a favor. I lend you the money only under compulsion. Well then, I will take it only under compulsion, Roderick exclaimed, and he sprang up abruptly and marched away. His words were ambiguous. Rowland lay on the grass, wondering what they meant. Half an hour had not elapsed before Roderick reappeared, heated with rapid walking, and wiping his forehead, he flung himself down and looked at his friend with an eye which expressed something purer than bravado, and yet baser than conviction. I have done my best, he said. My mother is out of money. She is expecting next week some circular notes from London. She had only 10 francs in her pocket. Mary Garland gave me every sou she possessed in the world. It makes exactly 34 francs. That's not enough. You asked Miss Garland, cried Rowland. I asked her, and told her your purpose. I named no names, but she knew. What did she say? Not a syllable. She simply emptied her purse. Rowland turned over and buried his face in his arms. He felt a movement of irrepressible elation, and he barely stifled a cry of joy. Now surely Roderick had shattered the last link in the chain that bound Mary to him, and after this she would be free. When he turned about again, Roderick was still sitting there, and he had not touched the keys which lay on the grass. I don't know what is the matter with me, said Roderick, but I have an insurmountable aversion to taking your money. The matter, I suppose, is that you have a grain of wisdom left. No, it is not that. It is a kind of brute instinct. I find it extremely provoking. He sat there for some time with his head in his hands, and his eyes on the ground. His lips were compressed, and he was evidently, in fact, in a state of profound irritation. You have succeeded in making this thing excessively unpleasant, he exclaimed. I am sorry, said Rowland, but I can't see it in any other way. That I believe, and I resent the range of your vision, pretending to be the limit of my action. You can't feel for me nor judge for me, and there are certain things you know nothing about. I have suffered, sir, Roderick went on with increasing emphasis. I have suffered damnable torments. Have I been such a placid, contented, comfortable man this last 6 months, that when I find a chance to forget my misery, I should take such pains not to profit by it? You ask too much for a man who himself has no occasion to play the hero. I don't say that invidiously. It is your disposition, and you can't help it, but decidedly there are certain things you know nothing about. Rowland listened to this outbreak with open eyes, and Roderick, if he had been less intent upon his own eloquence, would probably have perceived that he turned pale. These things, what are they? Rowland asked. They are women principally, and what relates to women. Women for you by what I can make out mean, nothing, you have no imagination, no sensibility. That's a serious charge, said Rowland gravely. I don't make it without proof. And what is your proof? Roderick hesitated a moment. The way you treated Christina Light, I call that grossly obtuse. Obtuse, Rowland repeated, frowning. Thick-skinned, beneath your good fortune. My good fortune. There it is, it's all news to you. You had pleased her. I don't say she was dying of love for you, but she took a fancy to you. We will let this pass, said Rowland after a silence. Oh, I don't insist. I have only her own word for it. She told you this. You noticed at least, I suppose, that she was not afraid to speak. I never repeated it, not because I was jealous, but because I was curious to see how long your ignorance would last if left to itself. I frankly confess it would have lasted forever, and yet I don't consider that my insensibility is proved. Oh, don't say that, cried Roderick, or I shall begin to suspect what. I must do you the justice to say that I never have suspected that. You are a trifle conceited, upon my word. When I think of all this, your protest, as you call it, against my following Christina Light, seems to me thoroughly offensive. There is something monstrous in a man's pretending to lay down the law to a sort of emotion with which he is quite unacquainted, in his asking a fellow to give up a lovely woman for conscience' sake, when he has never had the impulse to strike a blow for one for passions. Oh, oh, cried Rowland. All that's very easy to say, Roderick went on, but you must remember that there are such things as nerves and senses and imagination, and a restless demon within that may sleep sometimes for a day or for 6 months, but that sooner or later wakes up and thumps at your ribs till you listen to him. If you can't understand it, take it on trust, and let a poor imaginative devil live his life as he can. Roderick's words seemed at first to Rowland like something heard in a dream. It was impossible they had been actually spoken. So supreme an expression were they of the insolence of egotism. Reality was never so consistent as that. But Roderick sat there, balancing his beautiful head, and the echoes of his strident accent still lingered. Along the half-muffled mountainside, Rowland suddenly felt that the cup of his chagrin was full to overflowing, and his long-gathered bitterness surged into the simple, wholesome passion of anger for wasted kindness. But he spoke without violence, and Roderick was probably at first far from measuring the force that lay beneath his words. You are incredibly ungrateful, he said. You are talking arrogant nonsense. What do you know about my sensibilities and my imagination? How do you know whether I have loved or suffered if I have held my tongue and not troubled you with my complaints? You find it the most natural thing in the world to put an ignoble construction on my silence. I loved quite as well as you. Indeed, I think I may say rather better. I have been constant. I have been willing to give more than I received. I have not forsaken one mistress, because I thought another more beautiful, nor given up the other, and believed all manner of evil about her, because I had not my way with her. I have been a good friend to Christina Light, and it seems to me my friendship does her quite as much honor as your love. Your love, your suffering, your silence, your friendship, cried Roderick. I declare I don't understand. I dare say not. You are not used to understanding such things. You are not used to hearing me talk of my feelings. You are altogether too much taken up with your own. Be as much so as you please. I have always respected your right. Only, when I have kept myself in durance on purpose to leave you an open field, don't, by way of thanking me, come and call me an idiot. Oh, you claim, then, that you have made sacrifices. Several. You have never suspected it. If I had, do you suppose I would have allowed it? Cried Roderick. They were the sacrifices of friendship, and they were easily made, only I don't enjoy having them thrown back in my teeth. This was, under the circumstances, a sufficiently generous speech, but Roderick was not in the humor to take it generously. Come, be more definite, he said. Let me know where it is the shoe has pinched. Rowland frowned. If Roderick would not take generosity, he should have full justice. It is a perpetual sacrifice, he said, to live with a perfect egotist. I am an egotist, cried Roderick. Did it never occur to you? An egotist to whom you have made perpetual sacrifices. He repeated the words in a singular tone, a tone that denoted neither exactly indignation nor incredulity, but strange, as it may seem, a sudden violent curiosity for news about himself. "You are selfish," said Rowland. "You think only of yourself and believe only in yourself. You regard other people only as they play into your own hands. You have always been very frank about it. And the thing seemed so mixed up with the temper of your genius and the very structure of your mind that often one was willing to take the evil with the good, and to be thankful that, considering your great talent, you were no worse. But if one believed in you, as I have done, one paid a tax upon it." Roderick leaned his elbows on his knees, clasped his hands together, and crossed them shadewise over his eyes. In this attitude for a moment, he sat looking coldly at his friend. "So I have made you very uncomfortable," he went on. "Extremely so. I have been eager, grasping, obstinate, vain, ungrateful, indifferent, cruel. I have accused you mentally of all these things, with the exception of vanity. You have often hated me. Never I should have parted company with you before coming to that. But you have wanted to part company, to bid me go my way and be hanged. Repeatedly, then I have had patience and forgiven you. Forgiven me, suffering all the while. Yes, you may call it suffering. Why did you never tell me all this before? Because my affection was always stronger than my resentment, because I preferred to err on the side of kindness, because I had myself in a measure launched you in the world and thrown you into temptations, and because nothing short of your unwarrantable aggression just now could have made me say these painful things." Roderick picked up a blade of long grass and began to bite it. Rowland was puzzled by his expression and manner. They seemed strangely cynical. There was something revolting in his deepening calmness. "I must have been hideous," Roderick presently resumed. "I am not talking for your entertainment," said Rowland. "Of course not for my edification." As Roderick said these words, there was not a ray of warmth in his brilliant eye. "I have spoken for my own relief," Rowland went on, "and so that you need never again go so utterly astray as you have done this morning. It has been a terrible mistake." Then what his tone expressed was not willful mockery, but a kind of persistent irresponsibility, which Rowland found equally exasperating. He answered nothing. "And all this time," Roderick continued, "you have been in love. Tell me the woman." Rowland felt an immense desire to give him a visible, palpable pang. "Her name is Mary Garland," he said. Apparently, he succeeded. The surprise was great. Roderick colored, as he had never done. "Mary Garland, heaven forgive us." Rowland observed the us. Roderick threw himself back on the turf. The latter lay for some time staring at the sky. At last, he sprang to his feet, and Rowland rose also, rejoicing keenly, it must be confessed, in his companion's confusion. "For how long has this been?" Roderick demanded. "Since I first knew her." 2 years, and you have never told her?" "Never." "You have told no one?" "You are the first person." "Why have you been silent?" "Because of your engagement." "But you have done your best to keep that up." "That's another matter." "It's very strange," said Roderick presently. "It's like something in a novel." "We needn't expatiate on it," said Rowland. "All I wished to do was to rebut your charge that I am an abnormal being." "But still," Roderick pondered, "all these months, while I was going on, I wish you had mentioned it." "I acted as was necessary, and that's the end of it." "You have a very high opinion of her." "The highest." "I remember now your occasionally expressing it, and my being struck with it, but I never dreamed you were in love with her. It's a pity she doesn't care for you." Rowland had made his point, and he had no wish to prolong the conversation, but he had a desire to hear more of this, and he remained silent. "You hope, I suppose, that some day she may." "I shouldn't have offered to say so, but since you ask me, I do." "I don't believe it. She idolizes me, and if she never were to see me again, she would idolize my memory." This might be profound insight, and it might be profound fatuity. Rowland turned away. He could not trust himself to speak. "My indifference, my neglect of her, must have seemed to you horrible altogether. I must have appeared simply hideous. Do you really care, Rowland asked, what you appeared? Certainly I have been damnably stupid. Is NT an artist, supposed to be a man of perceptions? I am hugely disgusted. Well, you understand now, and we can start afresh. And yet, said Roderick, though you have suffered in a degree, I don't believe you have suffered so much as some other men would have done. Very likely not. In such matters quantitative analysis is difficult. Roderick picked up his stick and stood looking at the ground. Nevertheless, I must have seemed hideous, he repeated. Hideous. He turned away scowling, and Rowland offered no contradiction. They were both silent for some time, and at last Roderick gave a heavy sigh and began to walk away. Where are you going? Rowland then asked. Oh, I don't care to walk. You have given me something to think of. This seemed a salutary impulse, and yet Rowland felt a nameless perplexity to have been so stupid. Damns me more than anything, Roderick went on. Certainly, I can shut up shop now. Rowland felt in no smiling humor, and yet in spite of himself, he could almost have smiled at the very consistency of the fellow. It was egotism, still aesthetic disgust at the graceless contour of his conduct, but never a hint of simple sorrow for the pain he had given Rowland. Let him go, and for some moments stood watching him. Suddenly Mallet became conscious of a singular and most illogical impulsive desire to stop him, to have another word with him, not to lose sight of him. He called him, and Roderick turned. I should like to go with you, said Rowland. I am fit only to be alone. I am damned. You had better not think of it at all, Rowland cried, than think in that way. There is only one way. I have been hideous, and he broke off and marched away with his long elastic step, swinging his stick. Rowland watched him, and at the end of a moment called to him. Roderick stopped and looked at him in silence, and then abruptly turned and disappeared below the crest of a hill. Rowland passed the remainder of the day uncomfortably. He was half irritated, half depressed. He had an insufferable feeling of having been placed in the wrong in spite of his excellent cause. Roderick did not come home to dinner, but of this, with his passion for brooding away the hours on far-off mountain sides, he had almost made a habit. Mrs. Hudson appeared at the noonday repast with a face which showed that Roderick's demand for money had unsealed the fountains of her distress. Little Singleton consumed an enormous and well-earned dinner. Miss Garland, Rowland observed, had not contributed her scanty assistance to her kinsman's pursuit of the Princess Casamassima. Without an effort, the effort was visible in her pale face, and her silence. She looked so ill that when they left the table, Rowland felt almost bound to remark upon it. They had come out upon the grass in front of the inn. I have a headache, she said, and then suddenly looking about at the menacing sky and motionless air, it's this horrible day. Rowland that afternoon tried to write a letter to his cousin Cecilia, but his head and his heart were alike heavy, and he traced upon the paper but a single line. I believe there is such a thing as being too reasonable. But when once the habit is formed, what is one to do? He had occasion to use his keys, and he felt for them in his pocket. They were missing, and he remembered that he had left them lying on the hilltop where he had had his talk with Roderick. He went forth in search of them, and found them where he had thrown them. He flung himself down in the same place again. He felt indisposed to walk. He was conscious that his mood had vastly changed since the morning. His extraordinary acute sense of his rights had been replaced by the familiar chronic sense of his duties. Only his duties now seemed impracticable. He turned over and buried his face in his arms. He lay so a long time, thinking of many things. The sum of them all was that Roderick had beaten him at last. He was startled by an extraordinary sound. It took him a moment to perceive that it was a portentous growl of thunder. He roused himself and saw that the whole face of the sky had altered. The clouds that had hung motionless all day were moving from their stations and getting into position, as it were, for battle. The wind was rising. The sallow vapors were turning dark and consolidating their masses. It was a striking spectacle, but Rowland judged best to observe it briefly. As a storm was evidently imminent, he took his way down to the inn and found Singleton still at his post, profiting by the last of the rapidly filling light to finish his study, and yet at the same time taking rapid notes of the actual condition of the clouds. "We are going to have a most interesting storm," the little painter gleefully cried. "I should like awfully to do it." Rowland adjured him to pack up his tools and decamp, and repaired to the house. The air by this time had become portentously dark, and the thunder was incessant and tremendous in the midst of it. The lightning flashed and vanished like the treble shrilling upon the bass. The innkeeper and his servants had crowded to the doorway and were looking at the scene with faces which seemed a proof that it was unprecedented. As Rowland approached the group, divided to let some one pass from within, and Mrs. Hudson came forth as white as a corpse and trembling in every limb. My boy, where is my boy?" she cried. "Mr. Mallet, why are you here without him? Bring him to me." "Has no one seen Mr. Hudson?" Rowland asked of the others. "Has he not returned?" Each one shook his head and looked grave, and Rowland attempted to reassure Mrs. Hudson by saying that of course he had taken refuge in a chalet. "Go and find him, go and find him," she cried insanely. "Don't stand there and talk, or I shall die." It was now as dark as evening, and Rowland could just distinguish the figure of Singleton scampering homeward with his box and easel. "And where is merry Mrs. Hudson?" went on. "What in mercy's name has become of her, Mr. Mallet? Why did you ever bring us here?" There came a prodigious flash of lightning, and the limitless tumult about them turned clearer than midsummer noonday. The brightness lasted long enough to enable Rowland to see a woman's figure on the top of an eminence near the house. It was Mary Garland questioning the lurid darkness for Roderick. Rowland sprang out to interrupt her vigil, but in a moment he encountered her retreating. He seized her hand and hurried her to the house, where as soon as she stepped into the covered gallery, Mrs. Hudson fell upon her with frantic lamentations. "Did you see nothing, nothing?" she cried. "Tell Mr. Mallet he must go and find him with some men, some lights, some wrappings. Go, 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 sir, in mercy, go." Rowland was extremely perturbed by the poor lady's vociferous folly, for he deemed her anxiety superfluous. He had offered his suggestion with sincerity. Nothing was more probable than that Roderick had found shelter in a herdsman's cabin. These were numerous on the neighboring mountains, and the storm had given fair warning of its approach. Miss Garland stood there very pale, saying nothing, but looking at him. He expected that she would check her cousin's importunity. "Could you find him?" she suddenly asked. "Would it be of use?" The question seemed to him a flash intenser than the lightning that was raking the sky before them. It shattered his dream that he weighed in the scale. But before he could answer, the full fury of the storm was upon them. The rain descended in sounding torrents. Every one fell back into the house. There had been no time to light lamps, and in the little uncarpeted parlor, in the unnatural darkness, Rowland felt Mary's hand upon his arm for a moment. It had an eloquent pressure. It seemed to retract her senseless challenge, and to say that she believed for Roderick what he believed. But nevertheless, thought Rowland, the cry had come. Her heart had spoken. Her first impulse had been to sacrifice him. He had been uncertain before. Here, at least, was the comfort of certainty. It must be confessed, however, that the certainty in question did little to enliven the gloom of that formidable evening. There was a noisy crowd about him in the room, noisy, even with the accompaniment of the continual thunder peals, lodgers and servants chattering, shuffling and bustling, and annoying him equally by making too light of the tempest and by vociferating their alarm. In the disorder, it was some time before a lamp was lighted, and the first thing he saw as it was swung from the ceiling was the white face of Mrs. Hudson, who was being carried out of the room in a swoon by two stout maidservants, with Mary Garland forcing a passage. He rendered what help he could, but when they had laid the poor woman on her bed, Miss Garland motioned him away. "I think you make her worse," she said. Rowland went to his own chamber. The partitions in Swiss mountain inns are thin, and from time to time he heard Mrs. Hudson moaning 3 rooms off. Considering its great fury, the storm took long to expend itself. It was upwards of 3 hours before the thunder ceased, but even then the rain continued to fall heavily, and the night, which had come on, was impenetrably black. This lasted till near midnight. Rowland thought of Mary Garland's challenge in the porch, but he thought even more that although the fetid interior of a Heinesling chalet may offer a convenient refuge from an alpine tempest, there was no possible music in the universe so sweet as the sound of Roderick's voice at midnight. Through his dripping window pane he saw a star, and he immediately went downstairs and out into the gallery. The rain had ceased. The cloud masses were dissevered here and there, and several stars were visible in a few minutes. He heard a step behind him, and turning saw Miss Garland, he asked about Mrs. Hudson, and learned that she was sleeping exhausted by her fruitless lamentations. Miss Garland kept scanning the darkness, but she said nothing to cast doubt on Roderick's. Having found a refuge, Rowland noticed it. This also have I guaranteed, he said to himself. There was something that Mary wished to learn, and a question presently revealed it. What made him start on a long walk so suddenly? She asked. I saw him at 11 o'clock, and then he meant to go to Engelberg and sleep. On his way to Interlaken, Rowland said. Yes, she answered, under cover of the darkness. We had some talk, said Rowland, and he seemed for the day to have given up Interlaken. Did you dissuade him? Not exactly. We discussed another question, which for the time superseded his plan. Miss Garland was silent. Then May I ask whether your discussion was violent? She said. I am afraid it was agreeable to neither of us. And Roderick left you in irritation. I offered him my company on his walk. He declined it. Miss Garland paced slowly to the end of the gallery and then came back. If he had gone to Engelberg, she said, he would have reached the hotel before the storm began. Rowland felt a sudden explosion of ferocity. Oh, if you like, he cried. He can start for Interlaken as soon as he comes back. But she did not even notice his wrath. Will he come back early? She went on. We may suppose so. He will know how anxious we are, and he will start with the first light. Rowland was on the point of declaring that Roderick's readiness to throw himself into the feelings of others made this extremely probable, but he checked himself and said simply, I expect him at sunrise. Miss Garland bent her eyes once more upon the irresponsive darkness, and then in silence went into the house. Rowland, it must be averred, in spite of his resolution not to be nervous, found no sleep that night. When the early dawn began to tremble in the east, he came forth again into the open air. The storm had completely purged the atmosphere, and the day gave promise of cloudless splendor. Rowland watched the early sunshafts slowly reaching higher, and remembered that if Roderick did not come back to breakfast, there were two things to be taken into account. One was the heaviness of the soil on the mountainsides, saturated with the rain. This would make him walk slowly. The other was the fact that, speaking without irony, he was not remarkable for throwing himself into the sentiments of others. Breakfast at the inn was early, and by breakfast time Roderick had not appeared. Then Rowland admitted that he was nervous. Neither Mrs. Hudson nor Miss Garland had left their apartment. Rowland had a mental vision of them sitting there praying and listening. He had no desire to see them more directly. There were a couple of men who hung about the inn as guides for the ascent of the Tightleys. Rowland sent each of them forth in a different direction to ask the news of Roderick at every chalet door within a morning's walk. Then he called Sam Singleton, whose peregrinations had made him an excellent mountaineer, and whose zeal and sympathy were now unbounded, and the two started together on a voyage of research. By the time they had lost sight of the inn, Rowland was obliged to confess that decidedly Roderick had had time to come back. He wandered about for several hours, but he found only the sunny stillness of the mountainsides. Before long, he parted company with Singleton, who, to his suggestion that separation would multiply their resources, assented with a silent, frightened look, which reflected too vividly his own rapidly dawning thought. The day was magnificent. The sun was everywhere. The storm had lashed the lower slopes into a deeper flush of autumnal color, and the snow peaks reared themselves against the near horizon in glaring blocks and dazzling spires. Rowland made his way to several chalets, but most of them were empty. He thumped at their low, foul doors with a kind of nervous, savage anger. He challenged the stupid silence to tell him something about his friend. Some of these places had evidently not been open in months. The silence everywhere was horrible. It seemed to mock at his impatience, and to be a conscious symbol of calamity. In the midst of it, at the door of one of the chalets, quite alone, sat a hideous cretin who grinned at Rowland over his goiter. When, hardly knowing what he did, he questioned him. The creature's family was scattered on the mountainsides. He could give Rowland no help to find them. Rowland climbed into many awkward places and skirted intently and peeringly many an ugly chasm and steep-dropping ledge. But the sun, as I have said, was everywhere. It illumined the deep places, over which, not knowing where to turn next, he halted and lingered, and showed him nothing but the stony alpine void, nothing so human even as death at noon. He paused in his quest, and sat down on a stone. The conviction was pressing upon him that the worst that was now possible was true. He suspended his search. He was afraid to go on. He sat there for an hour, sick to the depths of his soul, without his knowing why several things, chiefly trivial, that had happened during the last 2 years, and that he had quite forgotten, became vividly present to his mind. He was aroused at last by the sound of a stone dislodged near by, which rattled down the mountain. In a moment, on a steep rocky slope opposite to him, he beheld a figure cautiously descending, a figure which was not Roderick. It was Singleton, who had seen him and began to beckon to him. Come down," cried the painter, steadily making his own way down. Rowland saw that as he moved, and even as he selected his foothold and watched his steps, he was looking at something at the bottom of the cliff. This was a great rugged wall, which had fallen backward from the perpendicular, and the descent, though difficult, was, with care, sufficiently practicable. "What do you see?" cried Rowland. Singleton stopped, looked across at him, and seemed to hesitate. Then come down," he simply repeated. Rowland's course was also a steep descent, and he attacked it so precipitately that he afterwards marveled. He had not broken his neck. It was a 10 minutes headlong scramble. Halfway down he saw something that made him dizzy. He saw what Singleton had seen in the gorge below them. A vague white mass lay tumbled upon the stones. He let himself go. Blindly, fiercely, Singleton had reached the rocky bottom of the ravine before him, and had bounded forward and fallen upon his knees. Rowland overtook him, and his own legs collapsed. The thing that yesterday was his friend lay before him, as the chance of the last breath had left it, and out of it Roderick's face stared upward, open-eyed, at the sky. He had fallen from a great height, but he was singularly little disfigured. The rain had spent its torrents upon him, and his clothes and hair were as wet as if the billows of the ocean had flung him upon the strand. An attempt to move him would show some hideous fracture, some horrible physical dishonor. But what Rowland saw on first looking at him was only a strangely serene expression of life. The eyes were dead, but in a short time, when Rowland had closed them, the whole face seemed to awake. The rain had washed away all blood. It was as if violence, having done her work, had stolen away. In shame, Roderick's face might have shamed her. It looked admirably handsome. "He was a beautiful man," said Singleton. They looked up through their horror at the cliff from which he had apparently fallen, and which lifted its blank and stony face above him, with no care now but to drink the sunshine on which his eyes were closed. And then Rowland had an immense outbreak of pity and anguish. At last they spoke of carrying him back to the inn. "There must be 3 or 4 men," Rowland said, "and they must be brought here quickly. I have not the least idea where we are." "We are at about 3 hours' walk from home," said Singleton. "I will go for help. I can find my way." "Remember," said Rowland, "whom you will have to face." "I remember," the excellent fellow answered. "There was nothing I could ever do for him in life. I will do what I can now." He went off, and Rowland stayed there alone. He watched for 7 long hours, and his vigil was forever memorable. The most rational of men was, for an hour, the most passionate. He reviled himself with transcendent bitterness. He accused himself of cruelty and injustice. He would have lain down there in Roderick's place to unsay the words that had yesterday driven him forth on his lonely ramble. Roderick had been fond of saying that there are such things as necessary follies, and Rowland was now proving it at last. He grew almost used to the dumb exultation of the cliff above him. He saw that Roderick was a mass of hideous injury, and he tried to understand what had happened, not that it helped him before that. Confounding mortality, one hypothesis after another faltered and swooned away. Roderick's passionate walk had carried him farther and higher than he knew. He had outstayed supposedly the first menace of the storm, and perhaps even found a defiant entertainment in watching it. Perhaps he had simply lost himself. The tempest had overtaken him, and when he tried to return, it was too late. He had attempted to descend the cliff in the darkness. He had made the inevitable slip, and whether he had fallen 50 feet or 300 little mattered. The condition of his body indicated the shorter fall. Now that all was over, Rowland understood how exclusively for 2 years Roderick had filled his life. His occupation was gone. Singleton came back with 4 men on of them, the landlord of the inn. They had formed a sort of rude bier of the frame of a chaise à porteurs, and by taking a very roundabout course homeward, were able to follow a tolerably level path, and carry their burden with a certain decency. To Rowland it seemed as if the little procession would never reach the inn, but as they drew near it, he would have given his right hand for a longer delay. The people of the inn came forward to meet them in a little silent, solemn convoy. In the doorway, clinging together, appeared the two bereaved women. Mrs. Hudson tottered forward with outstretched hands and the expression of a blind person. But before she reached her son, Mary Garland had rushed past her, and in the face of the staring, pitying, awe-stricken crowd, had flung herself with the magnificent movement of one whose rights were supreme, and with a loud, tremendous cry, upon the senseless vestige. That cry still lives in Rowland's ears. It interposes persistently against the reflection that, when he sometimes very rarely sees her, she is unreservedly kind to him, against the memory that during the dreary journey back to America, made of course with his assistance, there was a great frankness in her gratitude, a great gratitude in her frankness. Miss Garland lives with Mrs. Hudson at Northampton, where Rowland visits his cousin Cecilia more frequently than of old. When he calls upon Miss Garland, he never sees Mrs. Hudson. Cecilia, who, having her shrewd impression that he comes to see Miss Garland as much as to see herself, does not feel obliged to seem unduly flattered, calls him, whenever he reappears, the most restless of mortals. But he always says to her in answer, "No, I assure you I am the most patient."